Welcome to the Security Beyond the Checkbox podcast, where we interview experts who don't accept the bare minimum when it comes to cybersecurity. My name is Jason Furch, CEO at PurpleSec, and today we're talking about key performance indicators in vulnerability management. In short, we're going to discuss some of the metrics you should be tracking, and more importantly, how you can measure the results and prove successful outcomes in your vulnerability management program. I'm thrilled to be speaking with Walter Haydock, who's an accomplished cybersecurity and vulnerability management expert. He's the founder and CEO of StackAware, a cyber risk communication platform. He's also an author, consultant, ghostwriter for the Deploying Security blog. But wait, there's more. Walter is a Marine Corps vet. He worked at the National Counterterrorism Center, and to add to his already impressive CV, he's a Harvard-educated MBA. Walter, thank you so much for taking your time and lending your experience to this conversation today.
Thanks a lot, Jason. Really appreciate you having me on the show.
We appreciate you. So real quick, before we really jump into the discussion at hand here, could you introduce yourself to our audience and really talk through your journey into cybersecurity?
Yeah, sure. So really appreciate that background. That was a good overview. As for me, so my journey into cybersecurity started when I was still in the public sector working on Capitol Hill as a staffer overseeing what became the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. I kind of moved backwards from the policy side more into the technical side as I got older, which is non-traditional. But after business school, I worked at a big enterprise software vendor where I owned the security portfolio for an IoT product, and then went to a pure play security vendor. After that, that was a venture-backed company focused on data privacy. And then along the way, along the journey, I ran into the same problems again and again when it came to vulnerability management. So I decided that instead of complaining about the problem, I was going to have to do something about it, and decided to launch my own company, StackAware, late last year, and really excited about the things that we're doing in terms of making risk communication more accessible, specifically to business leaders, and ensuring that security teams are focused on the right things.
That's excellent. And yeah, you're right. If you want to see the change in the world, you have to be part of that. It's not just, being in the discussion. And, anyone who's listening, make sure you follow Walter here on LinkedIn. He's got some really, really great content there on his blog and everything else. So really, let's shift gears here, really jump into the heart of the discussion. I want to talk really about how vulnerability metrics really help CISOs and other security leaders prioritize their efforts in securing an organization. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of metrics, it's really important to get this right. And I see a lot of organizations getting it wrong. And it's not a bad-natured thing. It's not that people aren't doing their best. I think it's really just a matter of education and reducing the problem to first principles. So I'll get specific in saying that the most important metric for a CISO to focus on should be marginal risk reduction. So over time, is my risk increasing, decreasing, staying the same? Those are important questions that I don't actually see asked or certainly answered that frequently. What I see are security teams focusing on proxies, or what they think are proxies for that question. For example, how many critical vulnerabilities did we burn down last month? Or how many high vulnerabilities do we have in our network? And unfortunately, there's been a fair amount of research showing that questions like that don't correlate very closely, or sometimes even at all, with the risk question that I posed up front. So it's really critical that CISOs are focused on risk management, because I view them as being just another risk management professional in the C-suite. So you've got the general counsel who's focused on legal risk. You've got privacy officer who might be a separate organization focused on privacy risk. You've got the CTO who's focused on technical risk, and then you've got either general managers or the CEO himself who's focused on all of the risks. So cybersecurity professionals are really just managing one type of risk, and I think it would help to view metrics through that lens. Happy to talk more about that, but that's my high-level view.
Yeah, we'll definitely jump into some of that. a little bit later here, and it's interesting, that perspective. I haven't heard of it from a holistic point of view, the organization as a whole, and just managing risk at that one level, and just considering all of the different players involved, because that's really, if you're trying to make if you're trying to push an initiative forward, you need to be able to convince all of those players in some regard and get their buy-in in some regard as well. Um, so then, what are the KPIs that security leaders should be focusing on in a modern vulnerability management program, and why are they so important? Because you mentioned like criticality, and I've talked about this too. You don't just go after the high vulnerabilities because it says high, or critical vulnerabilities because it says critical. And you can chain attacks together. But what are some of those KPIs that we should be focusing on?
Yeah, so in a perfect world, in the most advanced, sophisticated program, you would be looking at annual loss expectancy at the individual vulnerability level. So that means, given that I have this vulnerability in my network, what is the financial risk posed to the organization based on it being there? And that, you can use a lot of different ways to calculate that. At StackAware, we use a modified version of the FAIR framework, the Factor Analysis of Information Risk. And that has many different components like downtime, reputational risk, judgments and settlements, foregone productivity, competitive loss, things like that. And the StackAware platform takes that information and makes some predictions based on previous events as to what the loss would be if you suffered a breach. And then you also need to look at the likelihood of a breach happening given that vulnerability. And I think there's increasingly good data, mainly via the exploit prediction scoring system, which is an openly available data feed that the Forum of Incident Response and Security Teams puts out, that lets you predict the likelihood that a given vulnerability will be exploited over the next 30 days, and then StackAware translates that to 365 days. So barring that, or on top of that, you also need to include contextual information. For example, if your developers have done analysis of data flow and they can confirm that it's not possible to reach the given vulnerability, then you potentially say that the likelihood of exploitation is zero. Maybe you want to hedge your bets a little bit and say it's a little more than zero. You could also look at whether the asset is internet facing or not, because that's going to increase the likelihood of exploitation if so. But the key thing to strive towards is annual loss expectancy. Now, that's difficult to do. It's hard to get there, and I'm building a company to help get other organizations there. But if you can't do that, what I would say is you should probably just focus on exploitability. And exploitability, I mean the likelihood of exploitation over a given period of time. Now, if all you do is just go to the first website, download their massive spreadsheet, and compare that to the vulnerabilities in your network and just pick them off from the top, you're probably going to be doing better than 50% of organizations out there.
Right.
And you're going to be saving a lot of time, and you're going to be reducing your risk substantially. There's some data that First put out in a recent white paper showing that if you were to look at a high and critical strategy using CVSS, and then you wanted to get the same risk reduction that strategy got you, you would need to do 12.5% of the work. So you need to do almost an order of magnitude less patching or code fixing to get the same marginal risk reduction, because the exploitability metrics are just much more targeted. So I would say first focus on ALE. If you can't do that, if you're still just starting out, then I would go to exploitability and use that as your go-to metric.
That's really interesting. So being more precise in how you're targeting things, and not just saying, okay, I've got a 10,000 vulnerability backlog, I need to burn this down as quickly as possible. And I need to stress out my IT teams and my vendors and everyone else. To your point, you may be doing all of these things and you're just kind of wasting those resources. Like, why'd you do that when I could be doing other things? And the other thing that about the exploitability, that there's this stat that keeps floating around, and maybe you can shed a little light into this. It's something like only 1% of vulnerabilities are exploitable. Is that something that you're seeing as well in your research and in everything else that you're doing?
So I think I know where that came from. I think that came from a Resilion report that was about 2022. I think they said that only 1% of known vulnerabilities in 2022 were exploited. And that sounds roughly right. I've used more conservative estimates of 10%, only 10% are exploitable. And that could potentially jive with that figure because that includes every CVE or every known vulnerability that's ever been published. Whereas I think Resilion was just looking at 2022 specifically. I'm saying that off the top of my head, so I might get some of those data points wrong, but I think that's where it's coming from. I would say that's the right order of magnitude. So the key thing is you mentioned having a backlog of 10,000 issues and stressing out your IT team. Sometimes you do need to stress them out, and sometimes it can't wait. So the risk posed by a handful of vulnerabilities is many orders of magnitude greater than most other vulnerabilities. So, Log4Shell, like when that comes out, when that was disclosed, you need to fix that within hours. I mean, that's drop everything. That is, I don't care what you're doing. Like you can suffer downtime. The risk is just so high because the likelihood of exploitation is so high, and the speed with which attackers move is so fast that you need to get that remediated immediately. And now there's a huge chunk of vulnerabilities where that's not true. So if you treat everything equally and just say, hey, I'm burning down my highs and criticals, you might accidentally put Log4Shell. I mean, that's kind of an exception, but you might put something highly exploitable at the end of that list, and you don't get to it before it gets exploited. So I would say you need to take a scalpel-like approach with prioritization. Obviously, if it's easy to fix, just fix it. Just if you can patch, just patch. But I found that's just not the case in modern technology stacks and infrastructures. And what you got to prioritize when you have these tough decisions. So I think exploitability is where you should look if you can't do a holistic quantitative financial risk analysis.
Man, you're bringing up nightmares for a lot of people when you mention Log4Shell.
I know.
But it's funny because that's like the one. It's such a good example of why you should be doing things this way. So then, in your experience, which metrics have the strongest correlation with a reduced risk of security breaches or incidents?
Yeah, so I would say you need to look at the speed with which attackers are going after something, and you can usually get an idea right away. If something is a network accessible vulnerability that doesn't require authentication, doesn't require any sort of privileges, that's going to be top of your list. If you've got something that looks like that in your network, just as a heuristic, before any CVE is published, before even an EPSS score is available, that's something that you need to fix ASAP. And then you can go down the list from there. Stackware actually looks at non-CVEs and provides some exploitability metrics for them as well, using those heuristics that I mentioned. So exploitability is definitely part of it. Another part of it would be kind of the enticement or the attractiveness of the target. So you look at certain industries, they just get hit more frequently than others because they've got more sensitive information. So, healthcare being a big one out there. Medical records are worth a lot on the black market. And then organizations that have a lot of revenue are, any organization is kind of a hacking target now because of ransomware. The data may not be valuable to anyone else, but it's valuable to you because you're doing whatever your business is and you need access to that information. So, but different organizations do get hit at different frequencies and intervals. So I would say it's a combination of the exploitability of the given issue or the amount of exploitable vulnerabilities that you have in your network, and then multiply that by the attractiveness of the target from a hacker perspective.
Makes a lot of sense, actually. Bring that down into an equation. Maybe that even makes it easier for non-technical people to understand and justify making these investments. And that's the way we look at it, is how can you invest in security and actually increase your ROI. You want to look at your security program as something that's always optimizing, always improving. And one thing that I wanted to kind of touch on before we go on to the next section here is the inverse. We've talked a lot about the metrics that we should be looking at. And we briefly talked about like CVSS scores and criticality, maybe not as important. I've had conversations with other experts and they tell me like mean time to detect isn't really that useful of a metric either. What are some metrics that come to mind that, we should keep in mind, but really shouldn't be over investing or emphasizing?
Yeah, I would say mean time to remediate is another one that probably isn't as important, and the key part being the mean. So, if you're good, if you are kind of generally good at burning down your backlog, but you burn down every vulnerability with kind of the same speed, or you just say, hey, pull a ticket and get in line, and we'll fix the vulnerability in that order, you might have a pretty good mean time to remediate or mean time to respond. But an organization that has a much worse MTTR that focuses on that 1% or that 10% and prioritizes those first, they're going to get breached less frequently, which is kind of strange, and people might push back against that, but it's only logical. If you're just generally good at burning down backlogs, that doesn't necessarily equate to risk reduction. So the mean part of MTTR is not something that I would focus too much on from a vulnerability management perspective. Certainly from like a SOC alert, I think that's much more important to have a good mean time to remediate, because you really have no idea what you're looking at when one of your tools fires an alert that there might be somebody in your network. But from a vulnerability management perspective, I think we can de-emphasize the mean time to respond. The time to respond for certain issues is certainly important, as I mentioned earlier.
Very interesting point there. I've heard the opposite, and I wonder if it goes to the old adage of it depends with things. Sure. Like if you're an organization that's looking to improve your processes, maybe that's where it's more important. But if you're looking really just at risk reduction and improving or reducing that risk to the organization, then it's maybe not as important. Makes sense in that. So
I would say just one more thing on that.
Sure. Yeah.
If you have two organizations and they're identical in every way, and then one organization has an MTTR better than the other, all things being equal, the one with the lower MTTR is going to be more secure. I would agree with that. But what I'm saying is, if you have a worse MTTR, but you've got a better prioritization strategy, again, it would depend how much, but you could potentially be more secure if you have a better prioritization approach, despite having a worse MTTR. So that's my point.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, and thanks for clarifying that. So we've talked about the metrics we should be taking a look at, the ones that we shouldn't be looking at. Do you have, can you share any examples of organizations that you've seen successfully use some of these metrics to drive significant improvements in their security posture?
Yeah. I think one example I'd give is an organization I was working with. Is they had a policy which is quite common, especially in software companies, and it's another policy that unfortunately I don't think makes much sense, but it's that thou shalt not release with any high or critical, according to CVSS, vulnerabilities in the software. And now if you it sounds odd to critique that, and you would think that you wouldn't want to release with any known vulnerabilities above a certain threshold, but it in a software, especially a software situation, that can get you into a weird place where you're about to release, you just run a new scan and you detect a vulnerability that's in your product in the wild. It's already in production, people are already using it, but the only thing that happened is you just detected it. So the detection of the vulnerability is not what hurts you. It's the fact that the vulnerability is there, but the vulnerability is already there. It's already in production. So blocking a release because of that newly identified vulnerability might actually hurt you from a security perspective, because you probably have fixes for other items ready to go. And if you pause the release and say, hey, well, we can't release because we just found this vulnerability, you might actually be preventing your customers from using more secure software. So what we did is we just looked at what was really the marginal risk or marginal risk reduction, and saw that, in fact, what's an increase of risk would be is if you add a new vulnerability. So if there's a security regression, or you add a new third-party library or something like that has a vulnerability, yes, do not release if you're increasing your risk surface. That makes sense. That's a bad idea. If you have new functionality that adds a new vulnerability, don't release with that. But if you know that there's a vulnerability already in production, releasing another build with that same vulnerability is not going to, at worst, the risk is going to be the same, but it might even go down if you've got other fixes kind of on the train ready to go. So it took a long time to kind of get through that logic, and I needed to do a lot of wire diagrams and things like that. But eventually we figured it out and got a policy in place that made sense from a risk management perspective.
Would you say that was maybe your I don't want to say greatest or biggest challenge, but one of the significant challenges when working with this customer, this client, of being able to communicate that clearly to them? Is that where you see the opportunity to kind of push these changes forward and get people thinking about security, the communication aspect of it?
Yeah, the communication aspect is by far the hardest part, because it's easy to write a policy that says XYZ. It's much harder to get people to implement it, and even more so if if it's a change from how people have been doing business before. So the the communication piece I find is critical, and I'm a pretty vocal critic of CVSS, and I get plenty of pushback from people, and some of them have varying degrees of validity in their counterparts. But I found the most common one is, well, everyone else uses it, so we must use it. And that's probably the most valid counterpoint to me coming in. But I would say, think about anywhere else that you're operating in a business context, and like imagine if you said that everyone else is doing something that's counterproductive, so we should do it as well. I don't think you would get very far in the business world if you said that. So attacking things from first principles is important to make sure, to help get the message across.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just because someone else jumps off a bridge, don't jump off a bridge too. Makes sense. So then, how can organizations effectively set goals for their vulnerability management programs, and how could these metrics that we've been talking about be tracked to measure the progress towards achieving those goals?
Yeah, so if you're in a perfect world, and you touched on it earlier, the ROI of every marginal step or decision or patch that you apply, determining that's the gold standard of security. If you can communicate that in terms of dollar ROI, you can say we 5x'd our money by applying this patch. That is really going to get you a long ways in security. Frankly, I haven't really seen it been done convincingly in any aspect of security so far. I mean, people have ROI calculators, things like that, and I think that's a good start. Some of that, having built some of those ROI calculators, some of that can be potential fairy dust. So getting to a true ROI number is that should be the goal. You should say something like security should mitigate twice as much risk as it costs to mitigate. And an example, you can make assumptions about hey, it takes this long to apply a patch, it takes this long for a developer to fix this bug, and then if you've got a quantitative risk management system in place, you can look at the risk that you've mitigated, and then you can go back to your business leaders and say, hey, this is the value that we're delivering. Hey, we need more funding because we're returning more than another business unit. And then, frankly, on the flip side, a business leader might say, well, actually, you're not reducing that much risk. You should reduce more, or you should do it more efficiently. Things like that. These are all tough questions that sometimes security leaders don't like to hear, but you should communicate with your business counterparts in terms of ROI, preferably using dollar signs if at all possible.
Yeah, that part's hard, and being more on the service side of things when we're talking to our clients, it's we've tried communicating the ROI, and to your point, like it's really hard to get an accurate number on that.
Yeah.
You can give some estimates. I mean, one thing that we've looked at is employee man hours. So how much time are we actually saving internally or your IT team and stuff like that? That seems to be another way for them to say, okay, well, I know how much employee X costs per hour, and I can do the math and say, oh, you're saving me $100,000 a year or something, whatever that figure is. Maybe make them do some of the math. So one of the things that I see a challenge in, and maybe you're solving this, and I see some other people trying to solve this too, is when you have multiple data streams coming in. So really want to talk about what are some of the best practices for integrating. You've got your scanner, maybe you have a prioritization software, maybe whatever you got out there. How do you bring that all together with your KPIs into a centralized dashboard or view?
Great. Yeah, great question. That's what I'm doing at StackAware, and I'll give you some examples. Qualys has a true risk score for all the vulnerabilities in their database. It's 0 to 1,000. I would say to that 0 to 1,000, what? Unicorns, pennies, dinosaurs. What does that mean? And then you look at Tenable. Tenable has the VPR, vulnerability prioritization rating, which kind of mimics the CVSS. It's a 0 to 10. So, you're somebody who's running all these tools, and you've got things on a 0 to 1,000 scale. You've got things on a 0 to 10 scale. How many tens on one scale are equal to a 10 on another scale? Or it's very hard to aggregate all this data. That's why I think it is really critical to get down to a lowest common denominator of dollars of risk, because that's transferable. Like, everybody accepts dollars, at least they do now. Not everybody accepts, I'll give you a 500 of some arbitrary unit. So having a way that makes sense, it's not going to be perfect to translate arbitrary figures into dollars, but having some sort of methodology for doing that is really important, because otherwise you're going to have policies that say, oh, for anything detected by scanner A, we need to fix in this amount of time. Anything with scanner B, we need to fix in this amount of time. And those are that's very hard to understand, very complex. And B, you're not even necessarily attacking problems in the right order when you do it like that. So being able to boil everything down to a single number is in my opinion critical. And then on the technical side, everything, if it doesn't have an API, forget about it, because there's no way that anyone's going to look at multiple dashboards in this day and age. And having everything automated to the extent possible is really critical. Another problem that StackAware is working on is vulnerability disclosure and notification. So the state of the art right now is, if your vendor declares or discloses a vulnerability in their product, they usually write a blog post about it. And based on the volume, that's probably like 0.1% of the time that they discover a vulnerability, they'll write a blog post on it. And so what do you do? During Log4Shell, I know from my customer research, what everybody did was every major customer sent like 900 vendors a spreadsheet and said, fill this in. And then every vendor got hit at the same time with 50 different spreadsheets in different formats. And like, while they're trying to fix a vulnerability, they're also trying to respond to these 50 different questionnaires. So having standardized communication methods is really important. And the vulnerability exploitability exchange standard, which is, there are multiple ones out there, but I use the Cyclone DX format. I find that very useful to kind of make sure that we're talking about the same thing. And StackAware lets you make those kind of disclosures in a machine readable way. And then kind of, to hook in a more trending topic, ChatGPT is all the rage. I've been doing a lot of experimentation, taking unstructured reports and turning them into structured reports. And that's something that's on the StackAware roadmap, so that you might get an unstructured kind of email or some sort of alert from someone. But if you can dump that into StackAware and use ChatGPT to convert that into a structured format, you might even be able to put that into a quantitative risk management system. So now you're taking kind of unstructured, fuzzy data and turning it into something real. So that's my take.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, it's the way you were describing it with all these spreadsheets and these different scoring systems. It sounds like an absolute nightmare to manage, on top of when you have a fire in the building and you need to, you're trying to focus your attention putting that out. And I think that it all comes to this point where it's, how does this unified approach help organizations speed up the remediation process and enhance visibility into vulnerabilities so that they can actually reduce cyber risk?
Yeah, I mean, that is the key question, isn't it?
Everyone's going for it. Everyone's trying
Yeah,
right now.
yeah. So, I mean, I would say you need to have a process in place first and foremost. I've seen many organizations that take an ad hoc approach to vulnerability management, and it's kind of, if something seems bad enough, then we'll do something about it type. And that I would strongly recommend against that, because you're setting yourself up to get burned, and even if you don't get burned, there's going to be huge internal kind of mess, or it's just going to be an avalanche of emails. No one's going to know what's going on. No one's going to know who's making the decisions. So having clear playbooks to implement whatever your established risk appetite and tolerance are ahead of time, that's really important, because otherwise it's just going to be chaos nonstop.
Yeah, that's very true. And, the ad hoc approach, unfortunately, I think a lot of people are taking that approach today. And really, I mean, the whole reason why I started this podcast was because I wanted to get off of the compliance, standard of doing things where it's like, okay, well, we do a quarterly vulnerability assessment. Anyone that I've talked to who's a security professional and is an expert and has been doing this stuff and wants to do it the right way, they just cringe. Like, they're like, oh my gosh, you're only doing that. And the reality is, you get an organization that, could be a healthcare system. I've talked to all sorts of organizations, maybe 50 to 100 staff, and that's all they're doing because that's all they have to do. And it really takes an event like a breach or a ransomware or something like that for them to find the dollars. Magically, they find the dollars, right?
Too
It's
late.
usually
Too late.
exactly too late. Um, so we talked a little bit about ROI and cost and everything. I wanted to get back to that conversation a little bit, and really, how should organizations consider the balance between costs of vulnerability management efforts and the benefits of improved security, and which metrics can help drive those decisions or guide those decisions?
Yeah, so on the risk reduction side, you can look at, I mentioned the FAIR model. That's one way to do it. You can say, hey, if we get breached, what is the average size of a breach? Like, how many records can we expect to be breached? What's the regulatory penalty going to look like? What's the reputational cost? Now, this stuff is really hard to do, having done it personally. It's challenging. So I try to productize this and make it as light touch as possible. But you do need to come up with some sort of figure in terms of what your risk is. Now, on the risk on the mitigation side, this is sometimes easier to calculate because people need to be paid every 2 weeks. Like, they draw a paycheck every 2 weeks, so you know how much pay they're drawing. Whether it cost how much it costs to buy a new tool, that type of thing. And I think the kind of cutting edge in this space is looking at downtime of applying a patch. So that's kind of probably the main objection that business units have when IT or security says, hey, we need to apply a patch to fix a vulnerability. The business unit is just very concerned that they're going to suffer downtime if you apply that patch. So there's a company that I just talked to recently called Tract that's looking at that side of the problem to try to determine what is the impact of applying a given patch. And when you look at those two things, when you look at the risk reduction and you look at the risk of the mitigation or the cost of the mitigation, that allows you to make really fine-grained decisions and say, hey, this is a super high-risk patch to apply. The vulnerability isn't that big a deal. Maybe we do this during our maintenance window next month. Conversely, if it's like a log4 shell and your probability of exploitation is near 100%, and the patch isn't that difficult to apply, that's like, do that yesterday. Wake the IT team up, get them to get that done.
Yeah, no, and I think some of that comes back to what we were talking about earlier with the challenge of communication. Yep. And being able to express it in that way. You're going to get more buy-in, at least from your CISO or whoever's leading security. And at that point, that's the most you can do. They're going to go to the bat for you, and they're going to fight and try and get the dollars or whatever investment needs to take place. And if the CEO says no or CFO says no, you're like, okay, well, we told you, we told you so. So now I know we talked a little bit about the dashboards and we talked about centralizing everything. And maybe this kind of bleeds into this next question here. How can organizations maintain consistency in their metrics across different teams, business units, departments, or even geographic locations?
Yeah, those are all very niche questions that I have answers to all of them because I've dealt with problems in all of these regards. So I'll say different teams. One thing I've seen in organization, especially in big organizations, is that different business units that work together might have different policies or might have different risk tolerances. So if you've got a product that is cloud hosted, I've seen the cloud hosting side have different vulnerability remediation policies than the product side, which makes absolutely no sense because the attacker does not care a whiff who is responsible for which part of the product, and you're clearly misallocating resources to one or the other, and you should even out the resource allocation to make sure that you're applying the same metrics to both business units because the attacker is just going to be going after one target. Another thing that I've seen is having different scanning tools in place. So, maybe organization or business unit A has, just one, and they do it every 30 days, or every quarter even. And then organization two, they may be doing it every day, or they have, it built into the CI/CD pipeline, which would be a best practice, from my opinion. So, if you're not having equivalent, risk detection tooling in place, then you've also kind of created an attack surface there. And then on the last, or yet another example I've seen is, I can actually name this because they made it public, but Palantir, who I think has a great vulnerability management program, I wrote a review of it, but they do have an odd twist where they say they remediate third-party code more slowly than first-party code, which to me doesn't make any sense because, again, an attacker doesn't care who made the code that they're exploiting. They just care, they want to get to their objective. So having consistent remediation timelines, irrespective of whether this is third-party code or first-party code, and focusing just on the risk is key. And then the last thing I'll say is in terms of geographic locations, one, don't use business days. Don't use that as a metric, because if you've got people in Israel and people in India and people, a business day means a different thing. Israel works Sunday through Thursday, and they've got different holidays than the United States. India has different holidays. So don't use business days because that just confuses everyone. Like, who's business day? And then the second thing I'd say is, this is from my military experience, use Zulu time when you're talking about times. Like, say this needs to be remediated by XYZ time, which is GMT, so that there's no confusion. So somebody in India doesn't say, hey, I thought we had 12 more hours to fix this, or that type of thing. Challenging to do and not traditional, but the most effective units I saw in the military, kind of everybody only talked in one time zone, doesn't matter where they are in the world, so that there's no confusion.
That's a really good point, and I don't think I've ever considered that before. Just the business days. That's good. And I am, by the way, a Palantir fanboy. So when it came to, the whole stock mania and everything, I was doing all my research, and the Gotham platform and everything. It's so cool what they're doing. And I think they're a model for zero trust and everything that's going on in that world too. So the next question I have here is, as the threat landscape continues to evolve, how can organizations adapt the metrics they track to stay ahead of emerging risks and ensure that they're focusing on the most critical vulnerabilities? And again, when I say critical, I mean more business impact.
Sure. Just using the general definition.
Yeah, not to confuse people.
Yeah, what I would say is you need to also worry about the unknowns in your vulnerability management program, because, like I said, you can be really good at burning down a backlog, but if you missed a certain vulnerability, or it's not even a public vulnerability, it's something that a scanner wouldn't find, then you can still be you can still be attacked by that vector. So penetration testing, threat modeling, secure design principles, and then in terms of the operational side, least privilege, zero trust. These are all important things to ensure that even if you've again, it's beyond the checkbox here. Like even if you've checked all your boxes, you still might have missed something, and a vulnerability scanner might not even have been able to find it. So you need to have a way to constantly reassess your blind spots and to make sure that you're not resting on your laurels, and ensuring that you can find those things that an attacker would be able to sniff out before the attacker does.
Makes sense, and I appreciate that beyond the checkbox plug.
Of course.
You mentioned ChatGPT. I'm in love with ChatGPT. And really, at PurpleSec, we're in love with automation and AI. Our belief is that it's not going to replace your day job. It's going to replace those tedious tasks. It's going to get those experts away from just pushing a button and scanning and then sifting through thousands of rows of Excel data sheets and everything. It's going to empower people to do more. It's going to drive down the costs. It's going to increase the speed, all of these great things. And I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I wanted to ask you, how do you see automation and AI-powered tools really advancing the future of vulnerability management?
Yeah, that's a great question. I thought a fair amount about that myself. I would say that you hit the nail on the head in terms of the drudgery going away. I would say that unfortunately there are a fair amount of people in security world who their jobs are mostly drudgery. They spend a lot of time pounding through spreadsheets and things like that. So what they're going to need to do to stay competitive is to figure out the why behind the tasks that they're doing, and also maybe if there's no why, then they should stop doing those tasks and focus on higher value things. But certainly in terms of data conversion, reformatting, converting between different standards and things like that, AI is going to have a huge impact. I mentioned unstructured to structured vulnerability reporting. That's another area that we're looking at. And then also asset identification. That's something that right now, actually, Stackware just rolled out a feature to do that. So if you have some information about an asset in your network, it might just be like a DNS, an IP address, an operating system maybe, but you can probably figure some things out about an asset just by information that you can get from a scanning tool. If you plug it into ChatGPT, you can use it to classify it. You can use it to come up with an idea of what the risk of the specific asset is, whether it's connected to the internet, all these types of things that previously might have required manual analysis. You can run this in an automated way and really cut down the time to insight, and then that'll help you drive your remediation program more effectively.
There's so many different applications for this technology, and I think we're barely scratching the surface. So I'm really looking forward to the next year. What is the next year going to look like in this technology? It's just exponential growth and everything. One last question that I had, and this is more for the security enthusiast, or we have part of our audience are students that are trying to break into security as a whole. What advice do you have for someone who's looking to get into vulnerability management as a profession?
Good question. I would say that you should be humble, but at the same time, don't accept the current way of doing business, because coming in fresh to a new discipline can really help in some ways. You don't have the curse of expertise or alleged expertise where you have these preconceived notions. So having an open mind and thinking about like, really, what is my job here, and asking that question directly of your manager, like, no, I get that these are the metrics we're looking at, but like at the end of the day, what's going to get you fired and what's going to get you promoted. Like understanding those things are important. And if you drill down deeply enough, there's probably going to be some sort of business objective there, not like a security objective. It's going to be, hey, delivering value to our customers, making sure that we retain their trust, making sure that our competitors don't get access to our IP, that type of thing. Those are going to be the underlying first principles for why you're doing your job. So understanding those very effectively will differentiate you from people who are just kind of button pushers to some degree, where they know how to work the tools and whatnot, but they don't really understand why they're doing something. So I would ask that question. At the same time, don't come in like acting like you know everything. Heck, I've done that before. I've gotten burned, early in my career acting like that. Don't be that guy or gal, and stay humble, but ask those questions, because if you're a new person, there's no harm in asking a question if something doesn't make sense. And if it doesn't make sense, you should ask a question.
That's great advice. Well, Walter, I want to thank you so much for your time here today. Do you have any closing thoughts from anything that we discussed?
Nope, really appreciate the conversation. Please look me up at StackAware if you're interested in vulnerability prioritization, cyber risk quantification, SBOM management, that type of thing. So happy to talk to anyone who wants to know more about that. And again, appreciate your time.
Great. Lots of actionable content here. Great takeaways. Again, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time.